Hello, I'm Kads, and welcome back to the Raid Starter Pack. So you're ready to take on the Celestial Griffin. Well, first of all, congratulations, you've officially entered the mid-game, meaning you're starting to progress into Doom Tower. Or perhaps you are endgame and you're just looking for ways to improve the speed and efficiency of your existing team. Regardless, I'm going to break down the nuances of the Celestial Griffin encounter, and I have two teams to showcase for you guys, the first of which is aimed at your first clear of Doom Tower Hard on this rotation, and the second one is the team that I use in the endgame to quickly farm the boss. One important thing to note is that these teams are tuned and will be run on stage 90 of hard, but of course the concept can be scaled back to wherever you are in your progression to Doom Tower, so you could use a similar team to beat it for your first time on normal, but my focus here is to get you farming Doom Tower hard as soon as possible. So first let's talk about what the Griffin does, and he's definitely one of the easiest bosses to do if you know what you're doing, but he's also one of the bosses that can kill you extremely quickly if you do not know what you're doing. So in order to go through his kit, let's actually start off with the passives, because these are very important things to understand when you're constructing a team. Starting from the bottom, the Fairwind passive, whenever you try to decrease his turn meter, it will decrease the turn meter of all of your allies, and if your turn meter is fully depleted, you will be stunned. So if you run the Evil Eye Mastery, that is probably the biggest culprit for small turn meter drops, you will stun yourself, on top of reducing the turn meter across your entire team. This can be resisted if you do happen to have enough resistance, but ideally you do not have the Evil Eye Mastery, or you have some solution to deal with it, and you just want to keep that in the back of your mind that generally speaking you don't want to decrease his turn meter. And also on the flip side, you actually don't really want to fill your turn meter that much either. Whenever you fill turn meter, his turn meter is increased by the same amount, but the turn meter increases are tracked individually and counted individually for each of your allies. So if you do a 15% turn meter fill across your team of 5 champions, that means you're giving him a 75% turn meter fill, which means he's going to cut in ahead of your team and start doing more things, which is bad when we get to the second passive here, Celestial Bond. This will add 1 Skybond stack at the start of each turn. So the more turns he gets, the more quickly he'll build up these Skybond stacks. And as you can see here, it increases his stats, attack, crit rate, crit damage, and speed by these respective amounts. And it will go all the way up to 20 stacks. At 10 or more stacks, it will start to ignore your shields, ignore block damage, unkillable, so you can't cheese it if he starts to get going. Essentially, he's just going to keep hitting harder and harder until he maxes out at 20, and he can easily start killing your champions very, very quickly. Another thing to watch out for is the Divine Strike passive, which is just kind of like a random counterattack that will always attack an enemy when their health drops below 50%, and then he will place a heal reduction if that wasn't enough, meaning that it's going to be difficult for that champion to heal up. So all of that is just his passive. So you don't want to decrease his turn meter, you don't want to fill your turn meter, you want to try and stay as high health as possible, and you want to give him as few turns as possible, i.e. you want to kill him as quickly as possible, and you'll see how we're going to do that when we get to the team composition. Coming to his abilities themselves, they aren't that bad, but it is nonetheless something you want to consider in terms of how you're going to build and construct your team. The A3 will remove all buffs from all enemies, so it's a full buff strip for your team, and it cannot be resisted, and his damage increases for each buff removed. This damage increase is somewhat negligible compared to the buildup of the Skybond stacks, but nonetheless, he will just hit harder the more buffs he removes. So ideally, you don't start the fight with any buffs. This is his leading ability, and this is on a 3-turn cooldown, so you're going to want to cycle your buffs in between if you're running on a manual, but if you're running on auto, then eventually he's going to catch up to you and start removing your buffs regardless, but ideally by that time, you're mostly done with the fight anyways. On the A2, and this is extremely important to consider, he will transfer all debuffs from himself to your team, and he will gain turn meter for each debuff transferred. Now, the easiest way to get around this is block debuffs. He will not gain any turn meter as long as you have block debuffs on your entire team, so you want to make sure that you bring that to this fight and make sure you put it up at the right time. Obviously, if you put it up first, he's going to remove it with his A3, so you want to place it or delay it by 1 turn at least so that it goes up afterward, and then he'll transfer all debuffs back to your team, and nothing will happen in terms of his turn meter. So just keep that in mind, that debuffs you place on him, unless they're protected somehow, will not stay on there for long, because every 3 turns he's going to transfer them back to your entire team. And then the A1, which is a relative breath of fresh air, is that he just has a 100% chance of placing a fear, and he attacks 1 enemy. So as I alluded to, the easiest way to deal with this boss is to kill him as quickly as possible, ensure that you have block debuffs, minimize turn meter manipulation in both directions, and if you can, bring some champion who has Brimstone, because despite what his abilities say, you cannot transfer Brimstone, so if he tries to use that ability, that will count as an active skill and you'll get the Brimstone proc. So as I mentioned earlier, the first team that we have have to show you is kind of like your first foray into beating the Griffin on hard mode. In this team comp, we have all the elements we need to beat the Celestial Griffin. We have an HP burn champion in Drexthar who's free to obtain from the bazaar, but it also has Brimstone notably equipped. We have an ally attack champion that is one of the best ways to deal damage to the boss, just because you have a lot of champions coming in to attack him. We have a DPS champion. In this case, I'm just using Fanax. I tried to make sure that this team is predominantly epics and or free / accessible champions. We have Rector Drath in the mix because ideally, just in case anything goes wrong, you do want to have some sort of tanky reviver, ideally built with resistance, because of course anything he does aside from the buff strip can be resisted. And then Skathix is in there. He is a void epic, but nonetheless he's representing any champion who can put block debuffs on your team. It's not mandatory that the block debuff champion is someone who also cleanses, but that doesn't hurt just in case you start to get out of sync relative to the boss's turns. One thing to keep in mind if you do want to future-proof your teams for the Griffin is that there are 2 affinities for 2 different rotations where he is featured in. This is the Eternal Dragon version where he is Spirit, and on the Dark Fae version he is Magic Affinity. So ideally your DPS would be Magic Affinity, but in this case we're just optimizing it around the Spirit Affinity and taking him on that way. So let's go ahead and see this team in action. There is a little bit of AI overrides here, but that's not super important. It just makes it run a little bit smoother. So we make sure that Fanax does his nuke, and then we have Drexthar saving his provoke for wave 2 just because it's a little bit more dangerous than wave 1. Lydia is locked out, so it's not that big of a deal, but we just kind of tank the freeze. Skathix, he does have his cleanse available, but we're saving it for when we get to the boss, and as you'll see, we'll use it at the right time just to make sure that we're in sync with the boss's abilities. So about 30 seconds for wave 1. This is not going to be a super fast wave clearing team, and of course we're also running a Spirit champion against a decent amount of magic champions, so it's not as efficient as it could potentially be, but nonetheless it will suffice if this is going to be just, your first clear, for example. So we get frozen a little bit once again. Pixnil is quite annoying on this stage, but no big deal. We're at the boss in around 50 seconds or so. So here is where it gets really important. We are delaying our abilities using A1s just because we don't want to place any buffs up just yet. Fanax stunned himself. As you saw, he does have the Evil Eye Mastery, but that is where the cleanse comes in handy because we have Skathix to come in there and prevent him from just staying stunned. And notably, we place block debuffs. We're ready to go. We tank the first or the transfer of the Griffin's buffs or debuffs, and so we're ready to roll. A cool thing about Drexthar Blood Twin is that he will consistently reapply the burn as long as he is attacked, and so that is a decent way to just get free damage throughout the course of the fight. And then Fanax, is our primary DPS doing as much work as he can, and then we're going to go through cycles here. The boss is already at 3 stacks, and you'll see that, but he's basically a third of his health. He strips all of our buffs, and then we're going back in at trying to deal as much damage as possible. Ally attack once again, just trying to do damage quickly. And then at this point, this is where we'll fall a little bit out of sync. Oh, never mind. Okay, decrease speeds on the boss. I lied. And so in this case, we're actually ready. Skathix does have his cleanse and block debuffs on a 4-turn cooldown, so keep that in mind. He's not the best champion for this, but he is an epic and potentially more accessible option for this. But sometimes the boss will lap you because he'll just catch up. He's getting faster with every turn he takes. And so because it's on a 4-turn cooldown, you might not have block debuffs up and ready to go. So if you do have someone who has it on a 3-turn cooldown, that would be more ideal. And we'll see a little bit more of that when we get to my version of the team. So as you can see here, the boss is starting to hit pretty darn hard. So we really do want to kill him as quickly as possible here. We have the heal reduction that we talked about from one of the passives on Drexthar Blood Twin. He's starting to kill people. That's not that bad, but it's fine. We're getting close to dying, but we're also close to the end of the fight. And as you can see there, because we revived Drexthar, we boosted his turn meter because that's how most revives work. And you saw the Griffin get a huge amount of turn meter. So just keep that in mind, even if you want to have some sort of revivers, healer support on your team. If you revive a lot of people, and let's say you bring them to 50% turn meter, the boss is going to get an instant turn and might just kill them right away. So keep that in mind. Ideally, you kill the boss before he gets up to like 10 stacks or so. And so you want to build a team that can DPS him down as quickly as possible. There are some variations where you can run like a Syl of the Drakes combined with a Drexthar Blood Twin or someone like that. Some sort of passive healing reviving champion who can definitely be paired with a burn, and thus you can kind of face tank your way through it. And even though he gets up to 20 stacks, you can just keep reviving, keep burning him, and eventually you'll get through the win. But I think it's just a lot smoother, a lot easier to build a 5-man squad that can try to take advantage of ally attack attack and some DPS to get rid of the boss. Now, if we switch gears to my team that I run in the end game, you can see we're going a lot more aggressive. We have more powerful DPSs, triple DPS. We have a block debuff champion who's now upgraded to Brogni. And note again, he's not a cleanser, so we're just putting it up at the right time, as we'll see. And then we're maintaining the ally attack with Lonatharl here. But essentially, this team is more optimized to do it as quickly as possible. And note, this is the team that got me the minute and 20-second run. And so we have a wave clear champion in Vlad. He just has a couple of AoEs that makes it a little bit easier to quickly kill the waves. And then we have two DPSs that are really strong when paired with ally attack, but also really strong against single target boss encounters. And they're both powered up by the increased attack from Brogni. So let's go ahead and see this team in action as well. If I was trying to be nitpicky, ideally Vlad would be stronger or faster than Rotos, just so he can AoE the waves instead of having to worry about Rotos doing a couple of turns there. But that's just an inefficiency of the gear on my Vlad at the moment. But ideally, if he was able to go first before Rotos, he could just basically clear the waves. And so that could be any nuker on your account, doesn't really matter. I just happen to choose Vlad because he has two AoEs that are relatively good at killing the waves. So here, same approach. Everyone's starting off with their A1s because we don't want to put up a bunch of buffs for the boss to strip off. A ninja is a little bit slower than the boss, so that's not a big deal. But here, we're putting up the block debuffs, and so we're ready to go. He's going to transfer all of the debuffs back, and it will be blocked, and he will not get any turn meter. And then we got lucky there with the Brimstone proc. So from then on out, we can basically just try and DPS as quickly as possible. So increased attack is giving us our nukers a lot more power. Ally attack coming in there. Ideally, bummer who got resisted, but ideally Ninja would place the decreased defense on the A1, as you can see there, and thus we're allowed to do more damage. And you can see here that we're only at 4 stacks on the boss, so he's only taken 4 turns thus far, and he's basically dead already at this point. And the thing is that you do want to try to make sure that you stay in sync with the boss, because again, he will get faster and faster throughout the fight. But in this case, as long as your block debuff champion is sufficiently faster than the boss, I believe he's 250 speed on stage hard 90, then you should be able to stay in front of him for at least 2 cycles. And you can see we killed him before he really completed 2 cycles of his abilities. So I think we're somewhere around 5 or 6 stacks of the Skybond. As you can see in this team, we do not have a reviver. So if anyone were to die, we're basically SOL as far as picking them up. And so, like I said, this is a more aggressive style of team where we're dropping the reviver, healing, support champions in exchange for more DPS, just again to kill the boss as quickly as possible, which is ironically the easiest way to deal with him and not let him build up these stacks. So let's go ahead and take a look at the builds on the champion featured on these 2 teams. And huge caveat here that these are definitely in endgame builds, and you don't necessarily need all of the stats on these champions. And I'll try to highlight that, especially on the mostly epic team. But like I said earlier in the video, just scale this appropriately to where you are in your progression into the game. So starting off with Skavix, he's in a pretty basic collection of sets, resilience and resistance, so nothing super fancy, a little bit of H or a little bit of toughness, and then some resistance, as you can see in his total stats. We're indexing fairly high into resistance. We don't want him to be controlled by the fear or anything like that. We want to ensure that he's able to cleanse and place block debuffs as needed. And so almost 70,000 on the HP, to almost 2,800 on the defense, 212 on the speed, and then 448 on the resistance, and 246 on the accuracy. So 450 is enough resistance to resist most things against hard Doom Tower bosses. But if you're scaling it down to normal, you probably only need around 300, 350. And in this case, you don't really need any accuracy at all because you don't need that part of his kit, the A2, for example, or decrease speed on the A1. It is helpful just because it could slow down the boss and help you cycle through your abilities if you happen to be using Skavix in particular. But again, if you're just progressing early on, you happen to have him, just build him high resistance with decent amount of speed, and that will suffice. For the blessing, I just went with Commanding Presence to just boost the power of the aura. I didn't really think there were many good options for him. And since I used to use him a long time ago for my progression into the Doom Tower, he was kind of like my epic Brogni, and you can kind of see the direct correlation there as far as replacement in the real team. But I did build his masters up a long time ago in the defense and support tree. We're indexing to a lot of the survivability stuff on the defense tree. We want this solidarity because he's placing a lot of buffs with with the shield block debuff, so everyone gets a little bit more resistance, and then we're indexing further into resistance with the unshakable as the tier 6. Support tree, we're starting on the accuracy side, but weaseling our way over to the left, and most ultimately ending on lasting gifts to extend the duration of any buffs he places. Alternatively, in the modern era, you could also run him in a protection set. You might have noticed that my Brogni is in a protection set. We'll check out his build a bit later, but you can run him in protection so that you can worry a little bit less about his buffs being stripped off. Next up, we have Farrakhan the Fat, who's in a reflex set with some speed gear. So he's just built fast, and he's there to he's in reflex to reduce the cooldown of the ally attack as much as possible. I didn't actually use his A2 in the fight just because most of the time the boss is going to throw the poisons and the burn back, even though it gets blocked by block debuffs. It's just dangerous to potentially put out debuffs that he's just going to throw back to your team in case you happen to get out of sync. The total stats here: 43,000 on the HP, 3,300 on the attack, almost 3k on the defense, 277 on the speed, almost full crit rate. Unfortunately, the gear just wasn't up there. 156 on the crit damage, and then 320 on the accuracy. So technically, he does have around enough to place his debuffs against hard level or hard tier Doom Tower bosses, but in this case, we didn't use him in this particular fight. For the blessing, I went with Phantom Touch because he used to be on my Fire Knight hard team, and so I wanted more chances to get more pips into the shield. And for any iteration of the Curse City variations of the Fire Knight, it's also handy to have that on your ally attack champions. But since he was always going to be replaced on the team, in my hard mode Fire Knight team, he actually does not have masteries. But if you're using him predominantly for PvE, then I would probably just kind of hug the left-hand side of the offense tree. Make sure you come down to War Master for the extra damage against bosses. And then you probably go the standard debuffer route, hugging the right-hand side of the support tree, ultimately ending on Sniper to increase the chance of placing Tinker's defense on the A1, and then Master Hexer to extend the debuffs that he places. Next up, we have my Rector Drath in speed and reflex, and her total stats are as follows: 70,000 almost on the HP, 3,200 on the defense, 287 on the speed. And yes, she does happen to be fully awakened, so she's getting a lot of extra stats here, but that is not necessarily mandatory for the success of the run. It just helps her stay alive a little bit easier. And lastly, 570 on the resistance. So she's just built to survive and resist anything and everything that anyone might put out there, and that is her build. At this point, she's more optimized for my hard Hydra team, but nonetheless, she fits into basically anywhere I would need to use her. And for that reason, to counteract the Head of Decay and his destroying of max HP, I put Miracle Heal as a blessing on her. Her masteries are as follows. We're indexing once again into the defense and support tree. Support tree focusing on a lot of the HP healing type masteries, but we're banking over to pick up Lore of Steel because I did intend to run her in a speed set, and then coming back to get lasting gifts to extend the duration of the veils and continuous heals. And the defense tree taking a little bit less damage from crits, a little bit of survivability from the center line here, and then ultimately ending once again on Unshakable for the extra resistance. Next up, we have one of my favorite epic DPSs in the game, and it is Fenax here. Super fun to use his A1 in a lot of places. He's in a lethal set, so he's trying to ignore as much defense as possible. Total stats are as follows: 43,000 on the HP, almost 6,500 on the attack, 266 on the speed, full crit rate, almost 300% on the crit damage, and then 314 on the accuracy, which is enough or around enough to be able to play some debuffs. But again, he's really just there to spam his A1 to try and deal as much damage as possible to the boss. And of course, this is horrendously overkill for where you're going to be in the mid game, so he doesn't need to be this powerful. It just means that your run's going to take a little bit more time, but eventually you'll be able to deal enough damage. And this could be anyone. This could be your best arena nuker, it could be someone else, different affinity and whatnot. So he's just filling the slot of DPS on that particular squad, and he happens to pair very well with ally attack champions. For the blessing, I opted for Crushing Rend to try and ignore as much defense as possible. Ideally, this would be 6-star to really get the full effect of it, but beggars can't be choosers. And then for the masteries, offense tree, kind of like a mix of nuking and then a little bit of damage. And so Helm Smasher, of course, is where we're ending to ignore as much defense as possible. This is more of an arena style build, but if you were using him exclusively for PvE, then I would go with War Master, kind of like the Ferric and the Fat suggestion. And then the support tree, I went down and hugged a little bit of the debuffer type masteries here. I opted to skip the rest of the T5s here because predominantly I just use them for the A1 wherever I use him. But if you want to boost the chance of him placing debuffs on his A3, for example, then Sniper might be the way to go, and or Master Hexer to extend the duration of any debuffs you might place. Rounding up the mid-game team, we have Drexthar Blood Twin, who is in a Guardian set with Perception. She was kind of just like the tank for the team, trying to steal some damage on behalf of other members, but also healing himself. And then again, he's just in there for the passive where he's placing the HP burns. So total stats are as follows: 50,000 on the HP, 4,200 on the defense, defense, 198 on the speed, over full crit rate, a little bit of crit damage, and then 441 on the accuracy. This accuracy is optimized for Amius on hard, and so it's definitely overkill for what you would need for hard mode of Doom Tower. Around 350 is all you would need to get. When it comes to the blessing, as we talked about earlier, we do have Brimstone. This is one of the best blessings for him because it's just more damage against any boss that you happen to use him on, and you basically just spam your A1, try to place burns, and you get attacked, and you place HP burns with your passive. Then for the masteries, pretty standard stuff, standard debuffer stuff on the support tree, hugging the right hand side. You could go Master Hexer. I opted to skip it just because if he gets attacked enough times, he's going to keep resetting the duration of the HP burn, so it doesn't really matter if it's two turns or 3 turns. And then for the offense tree, just make sure that wherever you go, ideally on the left hand side of the offense tree, you make sure to bank all the way back to Giant Slayer because he has a triple hitter on the A1. Switching over to my farming team, we have Ninja in a Relentless set with Perception. His total stats are as follows: 39,000 on the HP, 4,800 on the attack, almost 2,100 on the defense, 237 on the speed, full crit rate 238 on the crit damage, so a lot less than you might expect, but that is the nature of trying to run someone in Relentless when you are free to play and you don't necessarily win tournaments all the time to get a lot of good gear. But I digress. 323 on the accuracy, which is a little bit on the low side, but more often than not, he'll still place the burn against bosses in Doom Tower hard. Just like with Drexler, I'm also running him in Brimstone just because I primarily use him in this type of boss encounter, but I could also see an argument for running him in Nature's Wrath if you're using him also in other bosses like Chimera or Hydra or anything like that. For the masteries, pretty standard stuff as well. Offense tree, hugging majority of the left hand side, ultimately ending on a tier 6 of War Master. And the support tree, mostly the standard debuffer stuff, hugging the right hand side, a little bit more indexing into the offense tree, but making sure to pick up Lore Steel, extra stats. And then Sniper, Master Hexer, extend the duration of his debuffs and increase the chance of placing the decreased defense on the A1. Vlad the Nightborn in a smattering of gear, a little bit of speed, some perception, and some cruel. And again, I use him as primarily just a plug and play wave clear DPS because he has a couple of AoEs and then he can cycle through them fairly quickly. Total stats are as follows: 42,000 on the HP, almost 6,000 on the attack, 241 on the speed, full crit rate 238 on the crit damage, and then 364 on the accuracy. So enough to land it against bosses if need be. He can place decreased defense, and obviously he can't lock them out, but nonetheless he is a debuffer in that right, so he can enable more damage for your squad. And then for the blessing, I went with Cruelty. It's only 2 stars, so it's nothing crazy, but just a little bit more defense reduction because he already has decreased defense in his kit. And then for the masteries, pretty standard stuff. Offense tree, trying to get as much damage as possible, and ultimately ending on Helm Smasher in this case just because we want him to try and ignore as much defense as possible despite not being in a Savage set. And then the support tree, we're kind of zigzagging our way down, focusing on the accuracy stuff, Lore Steel to boost the stats of all the stat sets that he has on, and then of course Master Hexer to extend the duration of the debuffs that he can place. One thing to note is that in that particular fight on my team, I do make sure to turn off his A2, the turn meter decrease against the boss, because like as we mentioned, he will decrease the turn meter of everyone on the team if you don't have enough resistance, which could end up stunning people at the wrong time and just make the fight take longer, and so I don't use that ability at all. Next up, we have Underpriest Brogni, who I recently rebuilt into a pretty cool build of 6-piece protection with 2 pieces of Immortal. His total stats are as follows: 74,000 on the HP, 4k on the defense, 271 on the speed, full crit rate, almost 200% on the crit damage, and a bunch of resistance with a little bit of accuracy. Once again, this level of resistance is what you would need to resist debuffs in Doom Tower hard if you wanted to go that route. And then this is just enough accuracy because I do also use him in Faction War so we can strip buffs in case the Man-Eaters do their annoying things. For the blessing on my Brogni, I did once again go with Brimstone. This is just a good overall thing for him, provided he has enough accuracy for whatever fight you're using him in. But it also can proc whenever he reflects damage due to his passive from shields, and so you can kind of get a free turn of Brimstone just with the synergy of how that interaction works. And then for the masteries, mostly focusing on the offense and support tree, a lot of the offense stats dealing more damage when possible, ultimately ending on Giant Slayer, because when he does reflect damage with his passive, every instance of that can proc Giant Slayer, and so you can get a lot of enemy max HP hits into that or into your enemies based on them hitting your team. And then for the support, say we're focusing on the healing masteries, because in addition to reflecting damage when you attack into shields on your team, he will also heal you by some portion of that damage, and so we're just trying to boost that heal as much as possible. And then of course ultimately ending on lasting gifts. Next Next up, we have Lonatharl, who's just in a fast build. Call him Sanic, but double speed and perception, so trying to make him go as quickly as possible so we can cycle through his abilities as quickly as possible. 79,000 on the HP, 2,800 on the defense, 285 on the speed, full crit rate, 200% on the crit damage, and then 416 on the resistance. I opted to index into resistance on him. It is not mandatory, but I don't want him to get debuffed if I'm trying to use him against Doom Tower bosses and or hard mode Fire Knight. And speaking of hard mode Fire Knight, that is why I went with Phantom Touch on him once again, to try to get as many hits into the shield as possible when applicable. And then for the masteries, we don't really need any accuracy in his kit. He doesn't place any debuffs, so we're focusing on the offense and the defense tree. And the offense tree, of course, we're whittling our way over to the left hand side to end on War Master for more damage against bosses. And then the defense tree, a little bit of survivability, and then the chance to counterattack with Retribution. And lastly, we have my Rotos, who's technically in an arena build with his 6 pieces of Merciless, but nonetheless, he can do a little bit of damage against some waves and some bosses here and there as need be. Total stats are as follows: 45,000 on the HP, almost 6,500 on the attack, 3k on the defense, 261 on the speed, full crit rate, 318 on the crit damage. Of course, you do not need to have a Rotos or damage dealer this powerful. This is one of my best arena nukers on my account, so that is why he's built to the 9s. But any single target DPS or just heavy DPS can work in that slot if you're building a similar stealth team with the ally attack and whatnot. For the blessing, once again, with arena in mind, Ward of the Falling is extremely broken on him because it synergizes extremely well with his passive and can save his life from even a double hitter and still proc his passive to give him the extra turn. And then for the masteries, as you might suspect, we are optimized for dealing with the arena, so a lot of heavy hitting boosting masteries. Of course, we're ending on Helm Smasher to ignore as much defense as possible on top of the Merciless set. And then defense tree, we're zigzagging our way through a little bit of survivability with less damage from critical hits, which is of course something you'll encounter in the arena. And then we're making sure to end on Retribution because those counterattacks can end up killing people who happen to not kill him thanks to his passive. All right, so there you have it. This concludes the raid starter pack for the Celestial Griffin, with a couple of looks at what teams could look like from your first go to your final go. Hopefully you did find this helpful if you're trying to put together a team for the Celestial Griffin. And if you're a veteran who's just checking in to see what team I run against the Griffin, then drop a comment down below what your team is and how fast is your run against the Griffin. As always, if you did find this video helpful, then be sure to hit that like button down below. It really does help out the channel. And if you are enjoying the content on the channel, or you're looking for more Doom Tower boss guides, then feel free to hit that subscribe button down below because I do plan to cover every single Doom Tower boss. Thanks for watching and have a good one.